Hey, good morning, everybody. I got cut off in my last video, but I want to finish it up here. And before getting back to that video we were watching, I want to ask a couple of questions just to frame this a little bit. So, I was talking about the journalists covering the Iran conflict that we're in right now. I was saying they're not asking the right questions. So, what are the right questions to ask? Well, these are some that I don't hear asked enough. Or let's listen to some of these videos and see if this question is asked. So, what is the context for the conflict between these two governments? What is to be gained by war? What are the interests of those who are provoking Iran for war? Assuming that we're doing provoking, which I'll argue that we are. And what are the best interests of average citizens in the United States and in Iran and in the whole Middle East region? So let's go back to this video.
And drone. It was a go, one official said, and it wasn't. Another official said simply, cold feet. The stand down came 24 hours after this, an Iranian missile knocking an American drone out of the sky, sending it corkscrewing down into the ocean. The shootdown was celebrated on Iranian state television with a video purportedly showing the missile on its way to the target, but President Trump seemed inclined to write it off as just an accident.
I find it hard to believe it was intentional, if you want to know the truth. I think that it could have been somebody who was loose and stupid that did it.
That didn't sound right to CBS News analyst and retired Admiral Sandy Winnefeld.
I don't think it was a rogue attack. I think it was premeditated, and I do think it was a great mistake on Iran's part.
Based on what? This is an essential question. Based on what? We got to have evidence before we start this loose talk. Why are we talking like this? Why do we have people who are talking like this? What do they have to gain from war?
When asked about retaliatory strikes, the president was non-committal.
You'll find out. You'll find out.
But at an afternoon briefing, Democratic congressional leaders warned the president of the unintended consequences of even a limited strike.
The president may not intend to go to war here, but we're worried that he and the administration may bumble into a war.
The U.S. military spent much of the day.
Let me just say this as well. Well, let me say two things. First of all, why do we have so much power vested in one individual to make these decisions that have so much impact on all of our lives? Why is it one man that has all of this power? This is ridiculous. This is crazy. And one of the themes here is looking at presidential authority to go to war, whereas our Constitution states that Congress must approve for us to go to war. And then let me also just say this. There's no bigger critic of Trump than myself, but let's not try to pretend that this hasn't been the standard policy for every U.S. president. Maybe Jimmy Carter was the only one who was a little bit resistant to this line, and he got a ton of slack for it, or flack for it. But it's been since World War II, this has been the status quo. So let's just keep that in mind.
A declassifying intelligence to show the $110 million surveillance drone had not violated Iranian airspace as Iran's foreign minister claimed it had. The U.S. called it an unprovoked attack, which raised the question, would the U.S. be seen as weak if it did not retaliate against an attack on one?
Okay, so you see what's happening here. We're not provoking, yet you can look at a map of the U.S. military bases around Iran's border and tell me this, is that in and of itself not a provocative stance to have? Okay, so I'm going to move on to another video. This is kind of Chuck Schumer talking again. This is now CBSN.
To a war.
The U.S. military spent much of the day declassifying intelligence to show the $110 million surveillance drone had not violated Iranian airspace as Iran's foreign minister claimed it had.
Note that they didn't confirm anything. It wasn't stated that they confirmed anything, that they were it's just saying that they looked into it.
The U.S. called it an unprovoked attack, which raised the question, would the U.S. be seen as weak if it did not?
This is the same video. Okay, so then I'm gonna go to a couple of tweets that I've responded to over the last few days concerning this. And a lot of magazines, popular magazines, are doing the same thing. I listened to a podcast, KCRW's Left, Right, and Center podcast, which they basically are laying the blame on Iran, but there's no confirmation. And what hasn't been confirmed? It has not been confirmed where exactly the line is and where the drone was. Okay, that has not been confirmed. It also has not been confirmed that Iran was responsible for lighting the oil tankers on fire. Hasn't been confirmed. It may be suggested to a high degree, but hasn't been confirmed. There was also in Foreign Affairs magazine, they had a column basically saying, what's our strategy militarily when we go into Iran? And it was strictly tactical, looking at the tactics. And actually, that one was about Venezuela, which, it's a similar thing that's happening in Venezuela. And so we're skipping over. We're not asking, like, wait, what's actually happening here? We're not being very critical at that stance. We're already just thinking like, oh, we're going to go right into war. This is something that we do in our culture, and it's very clear to me in these instances more so than ever. And I think I was, the same thing like everybody else. I was kind of just satisfied with who the president was at the time. And I wasn't very critical. I mean, I was fairly critical, but I wasn't critical enough. And now that I'm already in a critical place, I'm seeing what's happening, and it's becoming very clear to me what the media is tending to do. They're acting very irresponsibly. And then the question is why? What do they have to gain? Well, I have a couple of videos now that will hopefully shed some light. And this is first Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard, 2020 Democratic presidential candidate. She has been the most outspoken against our foreign policy conduct and the way that we tend to talk loosely about war. And let's just listen to what she has to say. And this is actually Kyle Kulinski covering something that she said.
So Tulsi Gabbard proposed some new anti-war legislation. Check this out.
The situation with Iran. This president has designated, for the first time in history, the military of another country as a terrorist organization. How dangerous that is. What a dangerous precedent that sets. Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, literally said, when asked, so you're saying that the head of Iran's military should be treated the same as ISIS? He said yes. That is a direct abuse of constitutional power, a constitutional power that lies within Congress to make the decision to declare war or not. So I've introduced legislation to deal with some of these kinds of abuses called the No More Presidential Wars Act. And this legislation would make it an impeachable offense for any president to bypass Congress and to unilaterally go and start waging a war in another country.
Okay, so that's direct action that will hopefully turn the tide. That's why I am supportive of her presidency. If they're like, I'm very critical of the whole idea that one person has so much control. So, but just within that system, if there's one person that I trust to be commander in chief and to deal with these affairs in an honorable manner, Tulsi Gabbard is that person. And let's just take a step back. What could the United States be? What could their policy stance be so that we really are a broker for peace in the world? And as the strongest military and as the most powerful country in the world, it comes down to faith to some degree. You have to have faith that that's even possible. I have faith that that's possible. And especially if you're really honest with what we are doing right now, we're poking. It's ridiculous. We don't need to do that. If strength is demonstrated, think about a really confident, strong person that you know in your life. Are they going around talking shit and provoking people? They don't do that. They project confidence. They know that they're a savage. They don't need to do that. If somebody says death to America, that they can't even, that's not even possible. What are they going to do? They're not going to be able to go attack us right now today and really do much about it. So we gotta hear that and just be like, okay, bro, you can't do anything about it. So you don't have to even respond to that. You certainly don't have to be. That one guy was saying, like, is this going to be looked at as weak because we pulled back? No. What looks weak is when we go on there and we're like barking at people. Here we are, this big dog, and here comes this little dog that starts barking at us, and we're like, our hair is standing up, and we're like, no, man, you gotta be cool. We gotta be cooler than that. And also, I don't think I have any videos talking about one of the things, we pulled out of the deal, the nuclear deal, and you could be unhappy with those terms, but they were terms. I hear this argument a lot. Well, in 10 years, they would have had the right to have nuclear weapons. Not necessarily. And for 10 years, you know that they will not have nuclear weapons. Now with no deal, even that 10-year period is uncertain. So where is the logic in that? That is so, and that's where this really broke down. I mean, that was an awful decision. So I'm going to go on now. Let's listen to Bernie Sanders, another person who is actually outspoken in this in an effective way, and somebody that I trust would end this hegemonic behavior that we tend to have by our government.
Never-ending, perpetual warfare in the Middle East. I think we don't. And let us also never, ever forget that the worst foreign policy and military blunders in the modern history of America were based on lies. And that is the war in Vietnam, which was based on the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident.
You think the White House is not being truthful either about the attacks on the tankers previously or where this thing was shot down? Are you suggesting that we're not getting the right information from the U.S. intelligence services?
In terms of the tankers, as you know, there are differences of opinion. As best I understand, the owner of the Japanese tanker said that it was not a mine, but it was a object that flew through the air. In terms of this incident of the shooting down of the drone, there is a dispute as to whether it was in international territory or in Iranian territory. But even assuming that it was in international territory, even assuming that what Iran did is wrong, and they do a lot of things that are provocative and wrong. I'm not a great friend of Iran. Having said that, our job is to do everything that we can to bring about a diplomatic solution. Let us not kid ourselves. We have a president here, Donald Trump, who has allied himself with a brutal dictator in Saudi Arabia, who has been at war with Iran in every single way imaginable, who has led us into a war in Yemen, which has caused just horrific damage to that very poor country. So all that I'm saying is, let us do everything that we can to see that this crisis does not escalate, that it is settled in a diplomatic way. It is very easy for politicians to pound the table and talk about how tough they are, especially in an election year. But it will not be the sons and daughters of billionaires who get killed in those wars. It will be the working class kids of this country. So we have a responsibility to do everything we can to solve this crisis diplomatically, not go to war.
So, extremely well said. And here's another thing. The United States, we were born into this. I mean, I was born into this, where I didn't choose to be born in the country with the strongest military, with by far the strongest economy. I didn't choose that, but it happened. And with this comes a really great responsibility. These decisions that are happening, that our representatives are choosing to send us into war, they're choosing to put sanctions on to countries, that we don't even think about that. We're like, we might have an opinion either way, but it really doesn't affect us that much. But to people in these other countries, it affects them enormously. We don't need to know where Yemen is on the map. How many people even understand what's going on in Yemen right now and what our relationship to that conflict is? I would guess that only 15% of people know much about that. Yet, if you're a Yemenis person, you have no choice but to live with the decisions by the United States. So to pretend like, that's over there, that doesn't really pertain to us. Yes, it does. We control the world. Our hands are in everywhere, except for the few places where we tend to be in conflict. We're not in Venezuela, we're not in Iran, we're not in North Korea, and we're not in China. Those countries have, in a lot of ways, held out. They're not totally influenced by us. And that's where we have conflict. At the same time, think about if a country was trying to do something to us and how we would react. So this whole will of the people in an autonomous country idea, we go against that to serve our own interests. But then it's whose interests are these exactly? That's another question. I think Bernie touches on it. There's a small class of people who would profit immensely from war. And I guess this is the time where I'll also say this and just give a quick anecdote. Living here in Bath, Maine, I can see this definitely, where BIW, Bath Iron Works, which is, I think it's owned by General Dynamics. And General Dynamics is a massive company that is focused on building war machines. We're building Navy ships over there, these ships that take 1,000 people or more, a year to make. So you can imagine the investment that's going into these. And, but this is the largest, Bath Iron Works is the largest manufacturer in the state of Maine. And it's a place where it's one of the few places where you can have a high school degree or even not have a high school degree, and you can earn a living wage by working at BIW. So, and I'm sure this is all throughout the country. One of the biggest industries is related to defense. And I can understand, like, so our economy is so dependent on being in a state of perpetual warfare, to have this threat so that there is a demand for these instruments of war. Okay, and one thing that hasn't been talked about is how, and this is I wish I had a video for this, but basically we're arming the Saudis. We just made one of the biggest arms deals ever to put more weapons in the hands of the Saudis. And everything that's being said against the Iranian government and everything that's being said against the Venezuelan government and how bad they are, well, Saudi Arabia, what, you think Saudi Arabia is better? No, it's just that they are buying our stuff. That's the only difference. So just be cautious of that, because that kind of argument is disingenuous. And to me, it doesn't make any sense to be we're basically throwing gasoline on a flame over there. It's so counterproductive in the long run. In the short run, it comes down to BIW having more contracts so that people in the local community have a job. And look, I mean, that's a tough situation that we're in. But there are alternatives. And you can say what you want about the Green New Deal, but something like this that is going to recenter our focus, give us a different direction to go, give us an alternative to the military-industrial complex. We have to have that. Otherwise, yeah, we're just going to have a lower standard of living. And again, it just comes down to who's getting hurt. It's just the hardworking, blue-collar, lower middle class or lower middle income earning people, less educated people in this country, who would get hurt from that. They're going to get hurt by going to war, but they're also going to get hurt if we don't go to war, unless we have an alternative. Okay, and you can, maybe you're thinking right now, oh, you're just a communist, socialist, liberal. Okay, well, here's Michael Savage. This is somebody who I disagree with probably 75% of the time, but he's going to give you his perspective on how war relates to conservatism.
Up to Iran's threats. Now, I'm asking you, do you want war with Iran? It's the neocons who want war with Iran. What do I mean by neocons? The very same people who dragged us into war against Saddam Hussein the second time based on the lie of weapons of mass destruction, which didn't exist, are doing it all over again. A very dangerous cabal has settled in around Trump on almost every issue that we elected him for. They have superseded our desires with the desires of the swamp. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I'm the greatest. It's peace, domestic peace, international peace, peace between individuals, and peace between nations is far more important than gross domestic product or low interest rates. Hundreds of years ago, Thomas Hobbes said that the first law of nature is to seek peace. That is the essence of true conservatism. And I'm not just talking about the absence of military war on the battlefield. I'm talking about peace between individuals and groups within society. It's truly the opposite of progressivism, which seeks nothing but conflict.
Okay, there you have it. Doesn't sound, I couldn't have said it better. When you think of the word conservatism, does it sound very conservative to be extending ourselves, our tentacles, into all, encircling the globe? Doesn't sound very conservative to me. So the last video, or the last sound clip I'm going to share, this is important just to get some more of the context. This clip is a little bit long, so I'm just going to let this play. And but it's, I think, a just important context. What is the relationship between Iran and the United States leading up to this?
So the thing about Iran and U.S. relations is that I think the most important thing you have to understand is that the U.S. and Iran used to be allies. They used to be best friends. Iran was the U.S.
Iran is. I probably said it three different ways in this video. So I think it's Iran.
Best ally in the Middle East, and you have to ask yourself what happened. Like, in the 1970s we were allies, and then in the 1980s we hated each other.
Mm-hmm.
So what exactly happened in that time period? Well, you have to get a good grasp of like the history of Iran, or at least the modern day Iran. Obviously, Iran, their history goes back
the beginning
2,500 years. It's one of the earliest.
For sure.
Yeah, it's an early advanced civilization, and there's obviously great pride in that. But what happened is where I would start the story when explaining like the modern Iranian, the U.S. relationship with Iran now, is I would start in the 18th, 19th century when the British started when they discovered oil in Iran. Which is like an interesting story, is that the British started looking for oil because I believe it was Shell Oil
Company.
Shell Oil Company was purchased by the Dutch, and they lost majority of control over it. So they started frantically looking for oil, and they found oil. This is interesting. The reason how they discovered oil in Iran is that they were looking at history books. So they were going back in time. They were looking at mainly sources from like the 1200s, and they discovered that countries in the Middle East were actually using oil to light lamps.
So pretty much the same way that Samuel Tarly figured out that Jon Snow is actually Aegon Targaryen, then, right?
Don't spoil it. But yeah, so they discovered that, and then they're like, okay, let's go to the Middle East and find oil. So they literally sent people to walk around the desert until they stepped in it. And that's how they found it, because like back in the day, in like the Middle East has a lot of oil.
Yeah.
And you could just walk around. You could walk around and just
find it.
And then you step, there's oil. It's either oil or water that you're stepping into. And there's probably more oil than water in the deserts in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So they set up a deal. So this is like another interesting part, and I don't want to go too off track, but so at this time, the Brits were pushing opium to a very high degree.
This, by the way, is Bro History, Geopolitics, and Foreign Policy
of Iran.
Podcast.
I think they were called the Hajas. They were huge opium addicts, so they kind of used the opium trade as leverage to get access with Iran, and they ended up making this deal, this oil concession where the Brits would go and do everything, and they would keep 90% of the oil, while Iran would get 10%, even though it was like Iranian land or Persian land. And they had this really sweet deal, and they made the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And after that, they after World War I, they were going to lose it. Like Iran was slowly drifting to a point where they were going to lose that type of control over the country. And in the 1950s, Britain came to Truman, and they're like, "Hey, Iran just has a democracy now. They overthrew their monarchy. They have a democracy, and they just elected some guy, and he kicked us out. It's Mossadegh, and they kicked out the monarch. They elected Mossadegh, and they had they kicked the British out as well. So the Brits came. I'm repeating myself. But the Brits, they asked America to overthrow the government, and America waited until the Korean War was over, and they created a plan with the CIA, with Kermit Roosevelt, to overthrow the government, and they did. And the way they overthrew it was that they hired protesters in the street to pretend like they were supporters of Mossadegh. And they weren't actually supporters of Mossadegh. They were just paid cronies where you just hired them to
they were like the Russian bots of Iran, basically.
The Russian bots are like, maybe it could be anything. You know how like there's always I'm always suspect of like these large organized protests, in like both with like Antifa and like alt-right groups. I'm always kind of curious if there's people in there that are there to just cause more trouble in the
right. Well, probably because of how effective Kermit Roosevelt's like strategy was, right? Like he wrote the fucking playbook. Like he proved that you can pay off some people and basically create some insurgents to drum up a bunch of riots and shit, and then kind of direct things in the direction that you want them to. I mean, they bought up like newspapers in Iran to like print propaganda and a bunch of other stuff. It was super interesting. But so what happened then? Like, we get people to do the protests and like overthrow the government. Now what?
All right. So long story short, I'll skip ahead. They install the Shah. They overthrow the government and they install the Shah. Shah's a monarch. He's a dictator. He's not very popular. And we had a great relationship with the Shah, but he didn't have a great reputation in Iran. And eventually he was overthrown. He was overthrown while he left for medical care in the States. And ever since then, the U.S. has had a really toxic relationship with Iran. But the thing is, though, it's like history starts in the 1950s because we overthrew their democracy.
Right.
So they had the population had a reason to be resentful.
To dislike us, right.
To dislike us. It wasn't like they were it wasn't because of radical Islam. Like it was because of deep tensions between both parties that lasted for many years. It wasn't because like
regime change, basically.
They're not civilized because they believe in Muhammad. Like that's like, give me a break. Like that's not it. It's because we meddled with their elections and they got resentful of it, and there was a despot who was in charge of the country for a while.
Oh, that sounds awfully familiar.
So after that, we get. Are you making a slight hand at Trump?
Yeah.
I don't want none of that.
It was too easy. Sorry.
I know it wasn't easy opening. All right. So what happened was that after that happened, we went to Saddam Hussein and we kind of egged him on to invade Iran, and he did. And there was a 10-year war, or 1980 to 1988 or 89. There was a very brutal war in the Middle East. It was one of the biggest wars maybe ever in the region. And it was like World War I in the Middle East. It was just like there was trench battlefield, there was gas attacks, child soldiers everywhere. Like Iran was literally Iran is not a great place. Like no. I always try to state this. I always try to state this whenever I talk about Iran. Like I am not a fan of like the government in Iran at all. I've never been, and they've done really bad things. Like during the Iranian-Iraq war, they would throw 12-year-olds in like the trenches. Like they'd be like, "You're old now. Put helmet on," and like they throw them in and
take this gun.
They throw them into brigades at 12. Like you can find so many. If you type in just like child soldier Iran, there's just so many pictures of like child soldiers in the Iranian army. It's really crazy. Meanwhile, Iraq is being funded by the U.S. So they have all the latest and greatest gear. Like they have night vision goggles and all this cool shit.
Cool tanks. Artillery, yeah.
But the war ends up being a stalemate because Iran and Iraq, I guess it kind of evens out. You know, Iran has a much bigger population. Iraq had more advanced military equipment, but neither one could like conquer each other.
It was a stalemate, right?
It was just a stalemate. It was just it was brutal. Like Iraq was winning in the beginning, and then Iran came back. I think Iran at one point felt like they were destined to take over the rest of the country. It was just like, two bad guys fighting each other. But the war was brutal. Both countries were kind of ruined for a while, which softened up Iraq, which really like made it easy for the U.S. to beat them in a war right afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the U.S. would have beat them regardless, but it made it even easier, the fact that Iraq was like, just came out of a decade-long brutal war. And Iranian and American relations have always been really bad. In the 90s, Bill Clinton had a policy called dual containment. And dual containment was a policy where they would contain Iran and then they would contain Iraq. So both countries were perceived as threats. It was dual containment. And what George Bush, when he was elected, he ruined everything because he went and then he destroyed Iraq. And Iraq and Iran, the majority of Iraq is about 60% Shiite, 60 to 70% Shiite. Iran is about 90% Shiite, or 80 to 90% Shiite. And they became the biggest influencer in Iraq right afterwards. Because of course, it makes perfect sense. So we ended up empowering Iran in that region because we took out the government in Iraq and we put for all intents and purposes, a Shiite chauvinist government in its place. So of course they're going to create good relations. They're going to have a strong relationship with Iran, and we get upset about that because we don't like Iran. It's kind of like the girlfriend that broke up with you in college that broke your heart and you never got over it. You can never get over it. It could be like 10 years later, and you'll be like,
okay, so there's just a little bit of context for this, and it's so complicated, and I was going to try to just talk through all of this myself, but it's just, in part, it's a little bit over my head. I can't study it enough, and everybody who I just want everybody in my circle, anybody who comes across this video, to just get this perspective. And you have like TYT, you have Jimmy Dore. Oh, you got to listen to Jimmy Dore's coverage on this. In fact, just go watch Jimmy Dore, because he really covers the story in a humorous way. He makes fun of it in a really effective way, but also like pointing out that this is really, really dangerous. And again, as Americans, we have a really big responsibility. We have a big weight on our shoulders, but it's time that we step up. It's time that we decide that we want to have the moral high ground, and that we're going to be a broker of peace. We're going to be the good guy. But right now, we're not the good guy. But it takes citizens like us to be informed and not vote people in who are wishy-washy on war and who are taking a lot of money from defense contractors. We got to put people in positions of power that have an alternative. And part of what I'm going to try to do, what I'm trying to do with other podcasts and what I want to do in future ones, is I want to talk about ideas that are an alternative to the military-industrial complex. Okay? Thank you so much for listening.